I met Jeremy on a plane going to Istanbul several years ago, and by coincidence he was going to Istanbul in order to, I don't know what he was doing in business class by the way, but he was. I always thought travel writers were travel light, but he must have been the guest of somebody.
How embarrassing, yes, you've blown my cover.
And he was actually on his way to Istanbul in order to start the journey that resulted in the book Meander, based of course on the river Menderes. I know that Jeremy's been involved in Turkey for quite a number of decades. I think he first went there in 1984 as a teacher at one of the private English colleges in Ankara. This is his third book on Turkey. The first one has the ever so slightly embarrassing pun title of A Fez of the Heart. The second one is about the real Santa Claus, and this one is about the Meander Valley and River, and I think we're all looking forward very much to hearing what you've got to say, and we hope there will be some time for questions afterwards.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you. Much appreciated. Najee, is Najee?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. So if I'm still talking at 7:30, cut me off. Okay, cut me off brutally, and that's absolutely fine.
Stand up.
Exactly, stand up.
Yes.
Exactly, I can imagine she's very authoritative. Thank you all so much for coming on this cold night. I hope that in the course of the next hour or so I can take you somewhere warmer. This is the story of a journey I made down the Meander River, the Butte Menderes, in a small red canoe. My background is, as Sakiran described, I was a teacher in Ankara in 1984. It was the first time I'd really been abroad. I fell in love with the place very quickly. I did what I could to learn the language, although I'm still hanging on to this for all I'm worth. I travelled a lot in the course of 1984, 1985, and I came away from Turkey after a year's teaching there with an extraordinary sense of unexplored space and untold stories. This is one of the things about Turkey at that stage. It seemed that very few Europeans were going there. And I felt a real sense of just how rich the scene was. And as I developed as a writer in the years afterwards, it quickly became clear to me that Turkey should be, and was destined to be, the subject of my writing life. And so it's proved. I've written articles endlessly about Turkey and aspects of Turkish tourism, and I've also written, as Sakiran said, now 3 books on the country. What's important about my writing approach is that I like an oblique fact as a way of starting off. So the fact, as I discovered, that the Fez had this extraordinary history at the heart of Turkish culture, introduced in the 19th century as a symbol of progress and abolished in the 20th century as one of reaction, struck me as being a really interesting way of exploring this country. The same, if you like, with the idea that St. Nicholas, Santa Claus, had beginnings in somewhere as unlikely as Turkey. That set that book off. In the same, with this book, it was a strange and particular event that got me thinking about the Meander River. Right. One day I was at Miletus, which is a site I suspect many of you will know, between Kuşadası and Didim on the Aegean coast. A fantastic site from the late Archaic Age, so 600 BC I suppose was when it was at its heyday, now stranded amongst the silt beds of the Meander Delta. And I came across this postcard selection. I was probably looking at the lady at the top. I shouldn't have been. When I was drawn to this postcard and I pulled it out and I looked on the back and I discovered from it that this was the Roman river god Meander, reclining rather in the fashion of the lady above her. And I started to think about the life of this river and the ideas of fertility which are enshrined in the Meander, because the Meander Valley was an extraordinarily abundant agricultural area. And the idea was so I was thinking about the Meander at this stage, when later that day I happened to be travelling a little bit further inland when I came across this very unprepossessing river crossing with the sign Menderes there. And it was only then that it suddenly struck me that, of course, this river is still there. Why shouldn't it be? I think I'd assumed, like all fabled rivers, that the Meander, like the Styx, was either mythical or, like the Rubicon, mislaid. I couldn't believe it was actually still there. And as I looked at it, I had a sense, even though it wasn't very attractive that day, that there was enough of a river there for me to get a canoe down. So this is the point at which I began. I suppose I presumed that it couldn't possibly be there, and yet there it was. And for a travel writer, the sudden idea that the original winding river was there and could be explored by me was something that I simply couldn't exist. And at that moment, the idea of travelling the river in a canoe was born. Now, a lot of people are very confused by the meaning of the word and how it has its roots in the name of the river and how those two things can have come about. Well, certainly in around 500 BC, Herodotus makes the earliest reference to the Meander River and uses it as a simile to describe something else. So he's obviously thinking, if I want to, as he was at that point, if I want to describe a mazy, bendy section of the Nile, what do I use to get that idea across to my readers? And he talks about the Nile winding like the Meander, which of course is the river very close to his own home. 500 years later, the Anatolian geographer Strabo talks again about the Meander, and he talks of it running in a direction excessively tortuous, so that from the course of this river, all windings are called meanders. So that's to say, by the time of Christ, the figurative idea of this river is already beginning to take shape. And certainly in the subsequent centuries, it makes the transition into the Romance languages from the Greek and Latin, where in English, by the 17th century, it's used to describe everything. If you look at the dictionary, it's used to describe delirium, legal process, conversation, any number of things. And for me, come the 21st century, I had this idea of a journey in a freewheeling sense, where there was no agenda, no itinerary, no deadline. And that really appealed to me. So I took that idea and I began to think about it. Now, it's also worth making the point, for any of you who have an interest in art history, that the pattern, which is ubiquitous in classical and also neoclassical art, which we know as the Greek fret, here on a column base at Didim, at the temple in Didim, is also known very, very widely as the Meander pattern. So I liked the idea, as I was making this journey, that I would be given these continual reminders of the fact that the idea of diversion and going off course and distraction was enshrined in the actual stones and the mosaics and indeed the ironwork of the area that I was travelling through. Now I'm just going to show you a little bit of the geography, just so we get a sense of where the river actually runs. I don't know what your eyesight's like, but this is the source of the Meander here, and this is the mouth here. So it effectively runs west and east, trends east and west, with a lot of wiggles through this section of the country. What's important about this, of course, is that anybody who knows Turkey well will get a very strong sense that its position here makes it absolutely the historic main route into the Anatolian interior from the Aegean world. Anybody who's travelled the Meander Valley will be very aware of how flat and how wide it is. It's extraordinarily flat and wide. That's the consequence of all the silt that has been borne down, which made it a natural route for invasion and also for ideas, for the transmission of ideas. So it is that the river valley is associated with all the great marches of antiquity. Xerxes and his Persians went this way in around 480 BC on the way to Salamis. Xenophon and his Greeks went this way in 401 BC on their way to Persia. Alexander the Great again went this way in the 330s, going in the same direction. 300 years later, St. Paul travels through here on his first missionary journey. So there's an extraordinary sense of the weight of history travelling through this funnel in Western Anatolia. The pattern actually continues, because come the 11th century, as the Turks come in from Central Asia and finally break their way into Anatolia, it is again through the Meander Valley that they make their way down to the Aegean. And it's also up the Meander Valley that the Byzantine emperors in the following century, in the 12th century, rebuff them and push them back, albeit temporarily. And again, it's this river valley that the armies of the Second Crusade used to make their way into the Anatolian interior. So there's this real pattern that absolutely confirms the historical centrality of this river valley. Let's just go back one. What's interesting is that, albeit in recent decades, the area may have become something of a backwater. It's also the case that the very first railway line that was ever built in Turkey, starting at Izmir, runs up the Meander Valley before there's even a railway line in Constantinople. And this is that same railway line at the source near the town of Dinar. And here is the source itself. This is a small lake called Pınarbaşı, just behind Dinar, which is where the river begins. And this is where my journey in my canoe is intended to begin, except for the fact that I'm aware, having done some homework, that it is going to be very hard in these early stretches of the river to get a canoe down the river. Not only because of this, but because there are sinkholes in the early stretches of the river. That is to say, holes in the mountain where the river simply disappears underground and is gone. So I simply couldn't follow it there. I really had to, for the first stretch, I simply had to follow the river on foot and wait until there was an opportunity for me to put my canoe in the water. This is the river running through the town of Dinar. It's not terribly attractive. There isn't a lot of water in it. It's effectively a canalized ditch. So I'm walking through here, and on I walk until I get to one of the other issues about this river. Anybody who assumes from their knowledge of the river on its lower stretches with the wide valley that it's all like that has not been to the upper stretches of the Meander. This is an area near Chal where obviously I was not able to take the canoe. I'm not a very proficient canoeist, and I was travelling on my own, so it would have been foolish and dangerous to have even considered going down there. Having said that, this gives you a sense of some of the sort of landscape, some of the sort of adventure that actually travelling this river allowed me to access. It was an extraordinarily beautiful area. This is again the river valley up near Chal, which is to the north of Denizli, very, very remote and interesting country. So there we are. There's a sort of sense of the landscapes that I was travelling through. Now, the point came when I had a chance to launch my canoe. This is my canoe actually in this bag. It's a tiny, tiny folding canoe, as it had to be, because the only way I was going to get down this river was with something which was very, very portable. I didn't know what was lying ahead in terms of obstructions. I didn't have a very, very good idea of the landscape, because as anybody who knows Turkey well will know, maps are not a Turkish forte. And I've certainly found in my experience that if you show a Turkish person one of these, they tend to fall off their chairs. The idea of the amount of information that's freely available in a map like this strikes a lot of Turkish people as extraordinary. What I was dealing with because of this was the best map I could find of the area was a 1944 Turkish military map, which should not have been in my possession, I accept as much. But the scale was very, very good. And for anything which had happened previous to 1944, it was excellent. But what it didn't tell me was anything which had happened since the Second World War. So I was travelling with a certain uncertainty as to what might lie ahead. Therefore, it was very important that I had a piece of kit that I could, if need be, dismantle, put back in the box, and carry on down to the next stage. The other thing, of course, that I depended upon was the wonderful generosity and helpfulness of the locals. This is a Dinar lawyer who made it his business to be extraordinarily helpful to me, called Mehmet Özap. Mehmet, true hero. And he became my sort of wingman, I suppose, in the early stages of the journey. I was walking, and once I'd reached the point where I knew I could first launch the canoe, I rang Mehmet, and he turned up with this strange box which I'd given him, and watched as I began to put this thing together. He's scratching his head there because he's still not quite sure what's going to happen, and his friend's with him. And then here it is. We actually launched the canoe on a beautiful day on the upper reaches of the Meander, about 5 miles downstream of the town of Dinar. So we're only 8 miles, I suppose, from the from the source of the river at this stage.
What month?
April. April, perfect month for doing it. There was a good amount of water in the river. It wasn't too cold and it wasn't too hot, so it worked very well for me. And then off I go. This is me in my canoe at the very beginning of my adventure. What you don't see from this picture is what happens beyond that railway bridge, which is I go around the corner and suddenly the Meander, which I'm assuming from its name is supposed to be a gentle, sweet, sweeping river, turns into a rapid, a horror show of rapids. And I capsized several occasions, and it was a scary old day getting down to my first night, which was at a place called Gökgöl. But I did get there. I was wet and soggy and a little bit shaken, but I did get there, and I was on my way. Okay, so I've talked about the fact that it was a small canoe. It had to be a small canoe because I needed to be able to transport it. But this meant that I couldn't carry the likes of tents or catering equipment or anything like that. I had to depend upon the locals in terms of where I was going to stay overnight. And I was aware, having read a fair amount about the 19th and 18th century experiences of travellers, that there was, certainly at that time, an extraordinary institution of hospitality in the villages, whereby anybody who turned up was guaranteed to be looked after to a quite extraordinary degree. And there's a quote by Charles Fellows that I continually reminded myself as I was making this journey. It's going to be all right, people are going to look after me, and I'll just quote it. He talks about staying in a village near Kütahya, so a little bit north and west, but not that far away from the area where I'm travelling through. And he talks about being in a house when in came 9 people, each bearing a dish. I was informed that it is the custom of the people, strictly enjoined by their religion, that, as soon as a stranger appears, each peasant should bring his dish, he himself remaining to partake of it after the stranger has fed. The hospitality extends to everything he requires. His horse is fed, and wood is brought for his fire. Now, I was aware that that wasn't going to happen to me, given hotels, hire cars, and modern tourism, but I was sort of gambling on the hope that some sort of residue of that idea would still be there and was lying dormant, and that if I appealed to these people, they would do what I required, which was effectively put me up overnight. And the great news is that it worked fantastically. I would come into a village covered in mud as the sun was going down, with no warning at all, find my way to the headman and say, here I am, I have a canoe, what do you think? And time and again I was put up, and it was extraordinary. I was well fed, and for all my attempts to actually pay for my board and lodging in the morning, it kind of didn't happen. They wouldn't accept it. Nor did I once in this whole journey pay for tea. So I was endlessly struck by the generosity of the people of the lands through which I was travelling. Having said that, some of the lodgings were fairly basic. They weren't picturesque, really. This was typical. This is the farmstead, and this is the little house on the end where I stayed. I shared a room with the husband. His wife, who I think would normally have slept with him in that room, was removed to somewhere in the back of the house. And this is sort of how it went. I was extraordinarily touched by the levels of kindness that I received in the course of my journey. Now, while everybody was very, very generous to me, there was a real sense of bemusement, it seemed to me, amongst the local people that I met. No real understanding of why I should want to do this. There is no tradition of anybody ever actually going on the Meander River. People cross it, people occasionally fish on it, but you wouldn't use it as a way of getting from A to B. A, it's far too windy in the lower stretches, and B, it's far too remote and difficult in the upper stretches. In the lower stretches, you've got a nice wide river valley, so you'd simply take the road. So that was actually one of the attractions for me, the idea that I could do something that nobody had ever done, the idea that I could take a boat down a river that nobody, for all sorts of reasons, had ever bothered to travel down. So off I went, but again, as I say, I came across the bemusement of the local people. In fact, this extended to the point that I became a bit of a local celebrity, and I was forever being pursued by local television crews who were desperate to commandeer local peddlers and get footage of me as I was continuing on my journey. So this again became something of of a theme as I travelled downstream. Now, the other thing that happened was, time and again, people would say to me, absolutely straight-facedly, when they saw me in the canoe, they'd say, do you not realise there's a dolmush that travels to the next village? Why are you trying to do this? And the truth is, it would have certainly been easier to go in a dolmush, because this was a river, because there is no tradition of people travelling down it, there were continuous blockages, mostly of fallen willows, just piled in the river to the point where I could not get through. So I was forced off the river, and because the river has very wide fringes of reeds, which I simply couldn't penetrate, I was forced, time and again, to drag the canoe for maybe a couple of miles from where I came out of the river up until I could get back onto the stream. And this entailed me travelling through, for example, fields of barley like this, which was very hard work.
How much did it weigh?
The canoe itself weighs 14 kilograms, and then I had my kit, which was probably the same again. I would say it was about a 35 kilogram load, which I was sort of dragging like an Arctic sleigh through these sometimes muddy and irrigated fields. So along I went. I mean, one of the things that this photograph may give a sense of is just the fertility of these landscapes. This barley was high. It was about this high, as I travelled through these landscapes, I began to get a real sense of the fertility of this river valley, and also its beauty too. This is a place up near Chal. This is tobacco being grown here, and obviously this is a pretty rocky landscape. Further down in the second half of the journey, I would come across extraordinary abundance in terms of how quickly things were growing, in terms of walnut groves which had been saplings which had been planted 3-4 years before, absolutely shooting up. And of course, the Meander Valley is known. Its figs, the Smyrna figs, came from the Meander Valley. Licorice, grapes, any number of things, and of course the poppies, which, while grown under control now, still are grown in great abundance, and you see them everywhere. And these, of course, were the poppies which were feeding the habits of 19th century and 18th century Europe and England all the way through, De Quincey and Coleridge. Their opium came from the Meander Valley. So again, I was struck by the richness of the experience in terms of the sheer abundance of the landscapes that I was going through and their productivity. If you remember the river god that we saw at the beginning on the postcard, he's normally represented carrying a cornucopia or a horn of plenty, overflowing with the fruits of the valley. This is just another picture that I wanted to put in because it gives you a slight sense of the old realities. These are all female bottoms, hard at work, weeding a field of spinach, and these are two gentlemen who don't appear to be working quite so hard with their dog over in the other side. So they were beautiful traditional landscapes, but at the same time I was very aware that this was a changing world. This is a typical site. This is a pile of the canalets, the concrete irrigation canals, which are increasingly spreading across these landscapes, taking water from the river, doing damage to the river, and, if you like, industrializing the landscape in terms of improving the productivity of the soil. And what this meant sometimes was pretty dramatic. This is a day on the river when I'm canoeing along near a town called Sarayköy, which you may or may not know. It's near Denizli. The river's wide there. Beautiful. It's the most beautiful morning. I remember there were cranes flying across the sky, and the snow-capped Babadar was over here. And I went around a corner and I ran into it's called a regulator, regulateur, which is like a lock gate. Effectively, it's a temporary dam. And the way it works is that it controls the amount of water that goes through or is diverted into whatever arrangement they may have for either irrigation or for hydroelectric. And I arrived at this regulator, got out of the canoe, took it round to the other side, and what should I find but this? The water absolutely cut off. So the river had effectively been allowed to die by the dictate of the state waterworks. This was a problem for me, obviously, in terms of my continuation. This was the point at which I had to start walking until the river returned. I left the canoe where it wasn't going back for it. But I explored a little bit. And what I found, not far from the regulator, was this, running parallel to it. A huge canal feeding a nearby hydroelectric dam, with no consideration at all, it seemed, for the life of the river, which had been absolutely cut off. I sort of thought maybe they'd leave 20% of the water to run through. No, all gone. And then, to cap it all, there was a little sign next to it saying, "Let's keep our water clean." And I thought, you know, at this point it was beginning to anger me, this kind of disconnect between what had happened to the river and these sort of platitudes as to how they regard themselves as looking after it. As I travelled downstream, this became more of a problem. The water levels got lower and lower and lower, and dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. They were being fed by effluent from the riverside factories at places like Saraykoi, and by the olive oil presses, which are all along the banks of the river. So the water was pretty filthy. And I was interested by this, because everywhere you go in Turkey, it seems there is this kind of sanctity for water. It's absolutely at the heart of Turkish culture, as it is in any culture. But you see, time and again, repeated reminders of how important it is. So in the same way that English people have this habit of commemorating people with park benches, Turks seem to commission fountains, roadside fountains like this one here. And I saw lots and lots of roadside fountains the whole way through, which I suppose was really so that if you're out in the fields, hard at work, and you want to perform your ablutions before prayer, you're able to do so. There were these ones which were tap-fed, and then there were these ones which were even more delightful, because you can see the little chair here which somebody's arranged, and there's this lovely shelter, and this was regularly refilled with beautiful fresh water, which was carried by some local person from somewhere. And time and again I relied upon these to quench my thirst as I was walking through these stretches of the valley where I could not be on the river. And again, I was very, very grateful for this. And I found myself wondering, how long will people go on doing this for? How long will they continue to put fresh water in these amphora when there's almost nobody using them anymore? When, in fact, I remember on one occasion passing one of these, and there were plastic water bottles scattered around, which somebody by chance had chucked out of the window of the passing dolmush. So this struck me as interesting and sad, and in all sorts of ways relevant to the story. Okay, let me carry on. Here's another platitude saying precisely the same thing about the sanctity of water. All living things were created with water. But the river itself was not in a condition to in any way agree with that. Now, I've included this rather odd picture of a life jacket because when I got to the town of Sirke, which some of you may know, which is actually on the cotton plains, quite a long way down the river, I was tired. I was waiting for the river to recover. I'd been walking for days, and I wandered into a shop and I saw this. And I first thought, the sea's got to be near. And then I thought, at last somebody's endorsing what I'm doing here. Every time I'd told people that I was canoeing down the Meander, they looked at me, as I say, absolutely bemused. But on this occasion, I saw this image and I thought, it's going to be all right. It makes sense what I'm doing. And on I went. One of the things I haven't talked about, of course, is the richness of the city sites, the ancient sites, up and down the length of the valley. One of my favourite ones is Nisa, that some of you may know, but there's also Magnesia on the Meander, Miletus, Hierapolis Pamukkale is again very, very close to the Meander Valley. And then there are ones a bit further afield, but which in the course of the journey I was able to take days out to go and visit, like for example Aphrodisias, which is one of the most wonderful sites. And if I think back to my experience on that river, those were some of my happiest days where I'd done a couple of hard days walking and canoeing, and I was simply able to take time out to go and visit and some of these places and just luxuriate in the absolute beauty of not only the stones but also that this was very much a journey in the past. I don't want to give that sense, because of course the local people on whom I relied were very important, but there were all sorts of echoes about about modern life too. And let me just go on. That's by the way, that's Baffa Lake, which is utterly beautiful. And that takes us back to the image at the very beginning with which we started, which is very, very close to the Meander. So one of my meanderings was to actually leave the river and head off up the lake to Heraklia, which is absolutely gorgeous. Now, going back to the point I was making about the modern world, one of the places I came across near Aydın in the Meander Valley is the little village of Çakırbeyli, which is the hometown of Adnan Menderes, whose name, of course, is taken from the river valley. And he was the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Turkey. He was hanged by the military in 1961, and I was very struck. Time and again, local people would talk to me about Menderes. They would tell me that the grievance was still raw, that there was a real sense among the country people of that part of Turkey. They remember this man. And I was really struck by that in terms of where Turkey currently is, in terms of the rise of the AK Party, in terms of one of the things that Menderes was revered for by the local people. So there was a real sense that this wasn't only a journey through an ancient world, this was a journey where the echoes and the resonances are still strong and real. So, I eventually get back to Miletus, which I'd visited many years before, and where I first had the idea of making this journey. And it struck me as there was something typically Turkish, typically picturesque, in the way that when I eventually found the Meander River God, he was parked amongst the pine trees next to the Guardian's ancient motorbike, waiting for the building of the museum in which he would eventually be installed. I was very taken by that. And I'm now getting very near the bottom of the river. From Miletus, it's only a few miles. Through the silt lands, through the lands which weren't there when Miletus was a flourishing port back in the 5th, 6th centuries BC. And I started on a very early morning, and I knew I was getting close to the end of my journey. And I came round a corner, and there was the Aegean, and I'd arrived. One of the things I'd done at the top of the river, when I arrived at the lake where the source is, was take a small phial of water from the source, which I carried to the bottom, and I poured it into the river, into the sea at the bottom. You might say the water would have got there in its own time, but actually, given the images that I've shown you, it would not have done, because there were great stretches where the river was effectively dead. The good news, of course, is that in those final stretches, when I was travelling along Baffa Lake and then travelling through the delta, the river had almost miraculously recovered, and I don't really know why. There were fish in the river again, there were turtles in the river again, there were flamingos. It was the most beautiful landscape in the Meander Valley, and it's hard to understand, the Meander Delta, and it's hard to understand how it can be when you look at what has happened to the stretches of river further upstream. So I arrived at the bottom of the river, and this is me in a self-congratulatory moment. I'm a little bit sweating on having made the journey, and for the last time I started to dismantle my boat and put it away. So the journey was all but done. And I found myself thinking about what I had learned from the journey. And apart from the obvious things like the richness of the history, which we've touched on, and like the sheer hospitality of the local people, which I sort of was relying on and which was confirmed spectacularly, the other thing I was really impressed by was the fact that at no point in this journey did anybody try and stop me from doing it. I had assumed that there would be local officials, local bureaucrats who, having discovered what I was doing, would put some sort of obstruction in my way, but it never happened. Nobody ever tried to stop me. What stopped me were the fallen willows, time and again, and people insisting that I stop for cups of tea, and that was it. So it was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful journey, which I have no regrets about doing, and which really confirmed in my mind so many of the things that I particularly love about this fantastic country. There is a particular coda to all this, which is that in the course of travelling down the river, a lot of the local people had told me that the reason the river was so low was nothing to do with the dams, it was to do with the drought. Because they weren't able to see the dams that had been raised further upstream, they sort of assumed that it was simply not enough water was coming out of the sky. And while it's true that there had been something of a drought in that area for some years, it was largely to do with the dams. That winter, the winter that I got home, it rained. This is 2007. It rained more heavily than it's rained for years. And when I went back in the following spring, the river looked like this. There were huge amounts of water. And there were floods all the way down the Meander Valley, to the point where when I got back to Miletus, it was entirely covered with water, almost exactly to the point that it would have been back in the 6th century BC. So it was like the journey had come full circle, and the landscape had been remade as it once was back at the time of the beginning of this journey. I have got through that incredibly quickly. So what I'm going to propose, Nadia, is I'm going to, if I may, I'm just going to read a very, very short 2-page piece, which hopefully gives a sense of what I was looking for on this journey, which was human encounters with the local people, which for travel writers tend to be fairly fleeting, in that you're moving on, you're trying to get to the next place, and so you're just kind of grasping little bits of information from people to give you a sense of what it is that makes the local people tick. This is an encounter that happened to me when I was up near a Neolithic site called Aegean Sultan, near Chivril. And this is what happened. A palace once stood a few miles south of Chivril by a tributary of the Meander at a site now known as Aegean Sultan. The palace had long since disappeared beneath a grass-topped huyuk, or mound, along with all trace of the settlement's original name. The tributary now served as an irrigation ditch. I was making my way there the next morning, walking a road that passed through poppy fields, when a kitchen fitter drew up in a van. Ali was taking his wife and son to visit relatives in the nearby city of Denizli. I squatted in the back of the van, where loose screws skittered among the chipboard offcuts, spanners, U-bends, washers, and tile samples. There were glossy German brochures, but so neatly stacked, with careful folds at the page corners, that I suspected Ali only ordered their designer taps and baths in his dreams, the one place his clients could afford them. Even so, I was quick to point out, with the fluent insincerity of the hitchhiker, that Ali's kit clearly marked him out as a quality fitter. Ali nodded, though he seemed less keen on discussing kitchens than in learning how his lift might spend Sundays back home. Well, like you, I offered, visiting friends or relatives, a family meal, I continued, a walk. Unsatisfied, Ali eyed me in the rearview mirror. And to church, he asked. I understood Christians went to church on Sundays. I owned that there were better Christians. Ali frowned. You are a Christian then, he asked, but not a good one. Aegean Sultan was insufficiently distant for getting into, never mind out of, exactly what I was, so I merely nodded. You do know that there are other religions, Ali asked, ones that might suit you better. I told Ali that I was aware of the fact. Awareness is one thing, he replied, slapping the steering wheel, but are you actively looking into the matter? I admitted that I was doing no such thing. You should, said Ali. Everybody needs a religion. He handed me a business card in case my kitchen could also do with an overhaul, before dropping me, mildly admonished, where Aegean Sultan rose visibly from the plain. The carcass of a kingfisher lay in the road, one extended turquoise wing tipped with cobalt and edged like a condolence in black. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I thought that was terrific. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, but I wanted, first of all, just to ask Jeremy to fill in a detail, which is, how long did it take? You started in April. And
I started in April. It took a month. So the river, if you factor in all the squiggles, is sort of 280 miles in length. It's, as the crow flies, it's about 150 miles, but it's 280 miles, and I was probably travelling, on average, 10 miles a day. So yes, it took the best part of a month. I did travel pretty hard, and I came back on subsequent journeys to pick up on historical. I wonder if that's me. Is that me? Yeah. I think that's me, isn't it? If I turn this off.
Yes, true. Yes.
Turn it off and shout.
How do I kill it? Very bizarre. Very bizarre. So an hour, a month, forgive me. And as I say, I came back subsequently on 2 or 3 occasions to pick up on the history in places like Aegean, where I hadn't had time to do it the time before. I wanted to do the journey as quickly as possible because there was family at home, and being away for more than a month at a time was a bit tough on them as it was on me. So that's how it worked, yes.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Please.
Water has the reputation of generating quite a lot of insect life. How did you fare?
No, it was all right. I mean, I think that because I was so early in the season, they hadn't really kicked off by then. I really didn't notice that the mosquitoes at all, bizarrely. There was more of a problem in terms of the mud. I mean, the Meander is a muddy old river, and if you're getting in and out of it in the course of a day and negotiating the sort of obstructions that I was negotiating, by the end of the day you're pretty smelly, but you're not bitten. You don't tend to be bitten or troubled by the bugs.
Okay.
I am reading the book. I haven't finished yet. I wanted to finish, but how beautifully you wrote, and then just I visualized whatever you have shown as a picture here. It's beautiful.
Well, you're very
I
kind.
must
Thank
really
you so much.
congratulate you. It was wonderful.
That's extremely kind of you to say so. I'm heartened and touched. Thank
She
you
would
very
make a
much.
very, very good backbench member of Parliament asking a question to the Prime
Yes.
Minister. Would you agree with me that you're terrific? It's the sort of questions we like.
No money has changed hands, by the way.
Are you sure? Well, you got a free copy at the back, and then Lynette.
Did you take all the delightful photographs yourself?
Actually, I did, and it's kind of you to say they're delightful. I took a small camera with me, which was really just an aid memoir, just to kind of flick away, because I've never been trained as a photographer. I don't know about I was really just taking them so I would be able to remember with as much clarity as possible when I got home exactly what everything looked like. But I took them all myself, absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Lynette?
On the issues of the sort of dead bits of the river and the
Yes.
water diversion and so on and so forth, are you even remotely tempted to sort of look into that further and get onto the sort of, not the more political side of it?
Well, I mean, no, I think is the short answer.
Open that box.
In a sense I did, because the book's pretty clear about that. I mean, it becomes a strand, you know. I don't shy away from describing some of the worst outrages along the river, and there are some. So it's in there, and I guess it is possible that if anybody wants to take an interest, then so be it. But I can't see myself becoming a kind of crusader for that. I think it would be rather an exhausting cause to adopt.
But you have actually, by bringing
Absolutely,
it up.
it's all in
yes.
there. It's all in there, indeed. And I noticed the last time I was there that I think they're planning to extend the motorway down the Meander Valley. So it goes as far as Aegean now, but they're running it through to Dennisley, and that will be awful. I mean, that's a perfectly good road, and it seems to me a terrible thing that's happening.
Madam?
What was the local cuisine like? You said that you
Yeah, well,
what you offered?
it was all fish, bizarrely enough, yes. Interesting, because it wasn't river fish. It was all Hamsi, it was all Black Sea anchovies, fried in a kind of skillet.
Time.
That's what I had time and again. And I asked why they didn't eat the river fish, and they said because it's pretty horrible. But this was in houses, you know, that were literally 100 yards from the river, and they said the fish is no good. And interestingly, also, there is an old tradition saying that, you know, William Ramsay, who was a great antiquarian who travelled all through this area and wrote about it in great detail in the 19th century, talked about the fact that he had been told time and again that he could never find river fish which were halfway edible in the Meander. It's also true that there were plenty of fish farms, especially along the upper reaches. So when I was in places like Dinar, I ate a lot of trout, which was fine, but the local people did not eat the trout. It was too expensive for them. So Hamsi was the...
breakfast as well.
For breakfast we tended to have flatbread and cream and tomatoes. That was breakfast.
No white cheese, no bears.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, we have white cheese too. Yes, and olives. Yes, yes, yes.
Please.
General question. You were, as per this book,
Yes.
you were in Turkey in the early 90s.
Yes.
And then you talked to a lot of people because it's good how we like to
Yeah.
be the pulse,
Mm.
the culture of the people. What, in your opinion, has changed or is the same between those experiences in the early 90s and now? The mood of the nation.
Yes. Well, I suppose there's that feeling that the power is in the other hand now, that it's flipped, that the people, the country people talk with a new kind of a newfound confidence about, for example, Menderes. I suspect they wouldn't have talked about Menderes 20 years ago in the way that they happily did now. I don't know if that would kind of chime with your own sort of expectation of that, but it seems to me that they feel, you know, the natural country conservatives, it seems to me, feel that their time is now coming. In the same way that the city people feel increasingly sort of on the defensive in terms of you know, secularism and the values of Ataturk. So that would seem to me to be the most obvious thing that I noticed. The other thing that's worth saying, which is not really answering your question, Mehmet Ali, but and which we didn't talk about in the lecture, is the fact that the Meander, since it was always an invasion route, most recently between 1919 and 1922, when it was the southern edge of the Greek advance in the War of Independence, extraordinary bitterness through that valley that even now was described because of what had happened then. And I came across burnt out churches and burnt out mosques in villages even now. So there are still the visible signs of what happened in that between 1990 and 1922 in the backcountry villages of the valley.
Please,
I'm just going to ask you the meander, the word,
Yes.
and the shape of this particular river.
Yes.
You haven't spoken very much about the
About the
shape,
wiggliness
but
of it.
the wiggliness
Yeah.
of it. Do you
Yeah.
cover that in the book?
Yes, I do.
And
Yes, I do.
was there anything that particularly struck you about it? I mean, you didn't sort of nip out because it's 100 metres to the next bit of the river, which is actually 2
very
kilometres
interesting.
away.
Yeah, yeah. On the stretches when I was walking it, I found myself naturally cutting corners because I think most rivers tend to be very loopy. I mean, so quite why Herodotus and his ilk originally thought this was a particularly loopy river, I do not know. But yes, I was very struck by how wiggly it is. The other idea that seems to me to be possibly informing the word and the idea of meander is this. Because the floodplain is so flat and so wide, in my wanderings I often came across what they call relic channels. So this river quite often changes course and goes off in a different direction in a way that most other rivers don't tend to do. They're fixed in their bed and they'll stay in their bed. But actually, particularly in the Meander Delta, you would come across these in areas which hadn't been ploughed over, these old river channels, which is where the water had once run until it, for whatever reason, had decided to change direction and gone off down a different route. There's plenty of information in the book about that whole issue. And what strikes me as really interesting, going back to the name, is this: that the earliest form of the name we have is the Greek, so Meandros, from which our meander comes. But actually, if you make a leap back to the pre-Greek languages, to the Anatolian languages, Phrygian or Lycian or Carian, given what we know of the way those names work, where Ander is a very, very common cluster, so you've got Labranda and Unananda and many places using Ander, it is likely, although unprovable, that it was originally called Meander, and it's come full circle into the English.
Madam?
Yep. In your slides, the place doesn't look very populated. Is
Correct.
that a true picture of it, or have you passed areas which were quite populated?
It's a true picture of it, because it takes us back to this very wide floodplain. Below Saraykköy, which is about halfway down the river, it's 6-7 miles wide, so at least 3 miles on either side of the river. Nobody actually lives there. They farm it in the summer, but the settlements are right back on the edge of the valley for fear of being flooded. So you're right. I mean, I didn't come across that many people when I was on the river. I came across people who were in charge of dams. I came across fishermen. I came across individuals like that. And to actually meet people, I tended to have to wait until I got to the villages at the end of the day, or when I got into the towns where I would stay for a
How
couple of days.
populated?
Well, Aydın is a very good-sized town. Nazilli is a very good-sized town. I mean, they're both cities, and there are plenty of sort of country towns of, I guess, 20, 30,000 people, like Chal and Chivril and Suke, and then there are lots and lots of villages too.
You come across any nomads? because I've got in my home a couple of very nice kilims, which are Aydın Yörük.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So there used to be, obviously, around that area,
Yeah.
a substantial population of nomads.
Indeed, I didn't come across them, but I came across the Zeybeks, who are sort of related to that. The Zeybeks are the kind of the nomadic warriors, who were part brigands, part kind of.
But you weren't robbed.
I wasn't robbed. Indeed, I wasn't robbed. But the Zeybeks have this very honourable tradition because they were in 1919 when Ataturk raised the clans against the Greeks. It was the Zeybeks of Aydın who were the first to. Well, actually, there was a very famous historical event called the Battle of Aydın, which took place in 1919, when the Zeybeks drove out the Greeks before being driven out themselves. But I think I'm right in saying that in Turkish culture, the Zeybeks have a very honourable place. I think is that right? Yes.
Yeah.
Can I also ask you, is it 280 miles, the length? How much of that did you canoe, and how much of it did you have to walk?
Half and half. About, I would say half and half. There was a longish stretch from the point where I first got in the boat and capsized, which took me down to the very deep gorge that I showed you. And then I got out, and then there was another stretch, and then from Sarayköy I was able to canoe down to the regulator that I showed you where the riverbed was dry, and from then on it was hard. It was hard until about Söke, so that was a big long stretch where I did some days of canoeing, but I was basically paddling through half a bath full of water, and time and again I was running aground, getting out of the canoe, dragging it through the mud, and those were hard days. So I would say 50-50.
When you had to walk, did you carry it on your back, or you
I tended to leave it. I'd park it under the oleander or whatever, and then I would come back for it.
with the dolmush?
Exactly, the dolmush. So once I knew that it was more than just a kind of a drag for an hour, for a mile or two, like through the barley field, then it was time to pack it up and put it on a dolmush and take it to the point at which I'd got when I knew that the water was back in the river again. So it was a complicated business of sort of moving myself down the river and then going back to pick up the canoe, and sometimes actually befriending helpful, reliable local taxi drivers who I trusted, who I was able to describe the position of the package to, and they'd go and get it and bring it to me. And that worked very well, actually. That was fine. You know, the third oleander from the bridge, you'll find a bag. Go and pick it up and bring it to me if you would.
Any last questions?
Just a point that we do have listened to these people. We build on our banks of the river, and we get flooded. We don't seem to understand why they didn't in those days build on the river. They walked back to the mountain.
You're absolutely right.
It seems awfully simple, doesn't it? But
yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the traditional view of the Meander River Valley is that it is a place you go in summer where you plant your crops, and in winter you back off. I mean, of course you don't settle it, because you're going to get wet. But no, that doesn't seem to have translated into planning in places like this.
Well, I suppose England is a slightly more crowded country than
I guess.
than Turkey.
still
Well, it's very good to find that Misafir Perverlik is still alive and kicking in Turkey. I must say I've enjoyed your talk, Jeremy, and also the questions and answers afterwards enormously, and I'm sure everybody who's sitting here tonight has been enthralled. And we still have a few minutes if anybody else wants to buy the book at the bargain price. Otherwise, I'd like very much on behalf of the Society to thank you very warmly for coming up from Bath and giving us this absolutely enthralling talk.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.